How bad is the drought? Next on Wyoming Chronicle. Hello, I'm Richard Ager. Welcome to Wyoming Chronicle. Probably the biggest and most enduring story of the year has been the ongoing drought, here and around the nation. Among those hardest hit, Wyoming ranchers who are forced to sell cattle they can no longer feed. Let's start with the good news. Not everyone has been hurt by the drought.
I think our yields, it's up there as good as we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. I don't see any fall off. So I kind of think we got it made.
In spite of the heat and lack of rain that has plagued the rest of Wyoming, some areas like Riverton have escaped the worst.
We're kind of used to the dry weather, but with the irrigation that we have in this valley, it doesn't impact the crop production quite as heavily as places where they don't have irrigation.
We just kind of go on our system. When one guy gets done, he tells me and gives me a little notice, and I notify the next guy, and he takes it. And that's how we rotate through the system, and it works. I communicate with all my farmers. We all get along.
Most of Wyoming is not so lucky, with nearly every county now in severe to exceptional drought conditions. This scene is all too common. A herd of thirsty cattle heading off to a dried up creek.
See a little bit of water just come up in the creek right in here. And that's about the only bit of the water that we have in Horseshoe Creek right now.
Doug Oliver has been managing water resources in eastern Wyoming for 24 years. Now, right behind you is the source of, water that you usually depend upon.
Yes.
Where did it all go?
Well, this year, we didn't have any runoff to speak of. We had no snowpack supply. We got no timely rains this spring.
Tempers can flare when farmers and ranchers are cut off before summer even begins.
They get a little edgy, especially when you're coming in that early. They're depending on that water lasting them through August. This year, water didn't last through August. It lasted into May, in the middle of May, and it was done.
I'm in the Walker number 1 ditch, which feeds off of Horseshoe Creek. Even this late in the growing season, it's usually still half full. And the water rights here stem all the way back to 1879. Not that that matters this year. Britt Wilson lost his water in April, though his water rights go back to the 1800s.
I've been putting up 1,000 ton of hay. This year I'll be lucky to put up 300 ton of hay. And so it's down drastically. And
how do you withstand a hit like that?
You plan for it. We've socked a little money away to where when we take these huge losses, we can handle them a little better. And
but if this continues...
Yes, that's like I was just saying. If we have another year of this, it's just going to be, I can't even imagine, because a lot of guys had old grass from last year. There will be no old grass next year. And there will be no hay supplies. Everything's being sold.
At the Foy Ranch near Glendo, raising cattle has been a way of life for more than a century. But this year was different.
Well, we usually rotate our cows around through these pastures, and off the first rotation, by the time we come back around, the grass has grown back, and this year it never grew at all. And basically what we've got is old grass that was left over from last year, and it's just so darn warm for those cows that they required a lot more water. Hay-wise, we usually put up between 400 and 500 tons of hay, and this year we put up 28 tons on the whole place.
Rocky Foy has been able to hold on to most of his herd this year, but dreads the thought of a repeat.
I hate to even think about it. Another year like this would just be devastating. We would just have to sell cattle. That's all there is to it. There's no other way to, when you're out of feed, you're out of feed.
What's a ranch without cattle?
Well, it's a pretty tough deal.
One of the few places that ranchers have to turn is here at the Torrington Livestock Market. It's long been Wyoming's largest cattle auction, but this year it's even bigger.
Our normal May will sell 3,000. We sold 18,000 this year. June will average 2,500. We sold 17,000. And the numbers go that way. And it's not an increase in business. What we've done is rob Peter to pay Paul. We're going to be way short in our October, November, and December market numbers. It'll be the one we talk about 20 years, 40 years from now.
Inside, the young cattle enter and exit, nearly all of them here because of the drought. As the buyers look on, it can be difficult to make out which gesture is a bid and which is just a twitch. Outside, the story is more plain to see. Jerry Kennedy ran out of grass on his ranch north of Laramie, and so he brought all this year's calves to Torrington. His wife Evelyn came along too. After all, it was their 48th wedding anniversary. What a celebration.
Yeah, what a celebration.
These ranchers and others are sharing hard times in Wyoming, but they also share a tough optimism that belies their situation.
We might have a little trouble right now, but as long as you got a cowboy at the lead, you don't have a problem. And I mean that. Those guys will find a way to get the job done.
And joining me are Dr. Brett McDonald of the National Weather Service, Jim Wilson, Vice President of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and Jason Fernio, Director of the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, I know that all of you come to the drought story from different perspectives. So in just a few words to lead off, I'd like you to sum up your take on this year's weather. I'll start with you, Jason.
Thank you very much. This year's weather has been interesting, not only from a Wyoming perspective, but in the region as well.
Interesting, that's a mild word.
It is a mild word. However, we're seeing this drought that's extended into at least 8 or 9 states that are around us, and then it picks up again kind of in the south, central, and southeast part of the country, which has made for some really interesting options and lack of options, I guess, for some of the ranchers that are here and in the states surrounding.
Jim, what's your take?
It's kind of interesting because I'm pretty close to the rancher and get to go to a lot of different ranches and see what they're doing. They're definitely trying to save the cow herd. That's kind of the thing that keeps the home thing moving. Some of them are very, very diversified, have yearlings, and they've already moved the yearlings, and they're trying to scramble to find feed to winter that cow herd.
Trying to keep the herds together.
Yes.
Story I've certainly heard. What's your sense? You would look at this from, I think, a scientific kind of perspective.
Yeah, definitely. We would try to base it more on the actual numbers, measurements, put it in relationship to past years, kind of give comparisons.
And give us some superlatives here, Brett.
Well, when we're looking at the lack of precipitation, we go back and look at previous years. It's really hasn't been since 2007. Since we've had the heat this summer like we've had in other years. Precipitation-wise, we have to go back to 2004, 2003, the drought at about a decade ago. And then when you put it all together with both temperatures and precipitation, it keys back in on 1988.
Is this a historic year, do you think, weather-wise?
I would think so. It's definitely one side of the extremes, just like the last 2 years have been the other side of the extreme.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly there's some history here that you've seen unfolding, Jason.
Certainly, and I think Brett touched on that real briefly there. We came off such a wet year last year and the previous year, and now moving into where we just have, it's almost like Mother Nature turned off everything, and we're witnessing, a drought that is lack of rain and lack of snowfall in the mountains coming out of this winter, which is a fairly unique situation for Wyoming from my perspective.
This whole state has been designated as a disaster area with Teton County being the only exception. What kind of assistance is available for agriculture producers?
If we're looking at the federal assistance, right now it's fairly limited. That disaster declaration has opened up some low interest loan money. They've also opened up, I guess, some CRP grazing and some CRP hazing.
CRP
excuse me, the Conservation Reserve Program, which are
so
typically
federal lands.
They're private lands that are owned that have been taken out of production for various reasons, mostly on a conservation measure. But they're allowing for those to be hayed and grazed at a certain rate this year. Along with that, there are the low interest loans, but we're without a farm bill currently in Washington. It doesn't look like we'll have one prior to the election. And that is what the funding source for the other programs that are typically available. So it puts us in an interesting scenario.
Jim, would you say and would think most ranchers think that there is some real help available to them, or is it just sort of a few gestures?
I think probably most of the ranchers are figuring they're going to have to handle most of this themselves. And I think Brett's going to tell us a little more, but I think the bottom line is when we get moisture in Wyoming, maybe not how much. And we can grow grass if we get the moisture at the right time. Water is another huge issue. Filling reservoirs, water in the streams. I noticed on our own operation, springs are pretty low, and in a lot of places, none.
Well, I mean, everybody's hoping, praying for some kind of relief. Do you have any words of hope, or what's the outlook look like?
Well, the Climate Prediction Center's latest projections for the fall and leading into the winter time aren't that great. They continue with the above normal chance of temperature, but as we continue going into the winter, it's more equal chances of either below normal or above. The key is, from the global perspective, trying to look at the El Nino pattern. And right now we're actually kind of in neutral conditions.
El Nino, that big weather disturbance, you might call it,
down in the Central Pacific, correct. The last little bit we've been actually in some La Nina conditions, and we're transitioning into a weak El Nino condition. What that really brings for the western United States is kind of unsure at this time.
Well, I guess I would say that, you were talking about the Farm Bill. Is there a difference between assistance to farmers and ranchers? I mean, have farmers gotten some relief and ranchers not?
There is difference on, I guess, from a technical side. Typically, the Midwestern farmers operate under a different title of the Farm Bill. Most of our folks out here, which are mostly ranchers, we have about 80% of our cash receipts from ag come from cattle ranching, actually. We rely on the conservation title, so that puts in a few different wrinkles there. But I don't know that currently under the federal budget scenario that many people are getting the help that they would be looking for.
So I know, Jim, you were saying that ranchers, as is their tradition, are just figuring they got to handle this themselves. One rancher we talked to in the video piece, Rocky Foy, said that he had to lose some of his herd, but he doesn't want to get rid of the majority because he's been building up the herd over the years through breeding. And that's very hard to rebuild when you've spent years building it up.
Wyoming is known for its quality livestock. And I think those that can survive this drought, keep that basic cow herd here and in producing, I think is going to, the dividends will be very beneficial to the Wyoming rancher, because those genetics are sought after worldwide. And it would, if we could just keep it going and keep that thing moving, it could be a plus.
Well, I mean, how hard is it to rebuild a herd if let's say a second year of drought were to come along, and a lot of the ranchers I talked to said they'd really have to sell at that point?
Well, it takes a lifetime a lot of times to build a quality genetic herd of cattle. If those cattle leave that ranch in this situation, like Jason was saying, it involves a 9 or 10 or 11 state area, that those cattle will probably go to slaughter and will not be moved to another breeding program somewhere. They would have to go a long ways. So we're looking at generations of time to put that herd back together and keep that quality here.
In looking to the future, and even over the short term, I spoke to one water system manager in Thermopolis, and they draw out of the Boysen Reservoir. She said that they were fine for now, but you know, as you look a couple of years from now, if you're saying sounds like a little snowpack, then there's not that much to replenish the reservoirs, is there?
Right. It would be very hard to keep the reservoirs back up to 100% in the spring like we typically do, or have overflow like we have the last couple of winters. The reservoirs actually in Wyoming right now are not doing too bad. I just checked numbers this morning, and 75% capacity for a couple of the larger ones, lower down for some of the others, but as you drive around you can definitely see that there's a lot more shoreline than typically exists.
Certainly, I drove past the Glendo reservoir, and also the Boysen, and the happiest creatures there seem to be the herons in the mudflats, picking away at what would not normally be visible. Give us a sense, Jason, of what that's going to mean, because you know, even the water that we see there is not necessarily ours.
Well, and that is true. I mean, we're involved in several interstate compacts with our water, so we do store and supply water for other states as well. However, I do think we've had very solid water management the last couple of years. With, if we think back 3 years ago, people were worried what we were going to do with all the water that was coming over, because even as we emptied them out, they was still overflowing the dams. I think we've got a real good system in place to store water when we have it. So hopefully that will continue moving down.
It's kind of ironic, Jim. You look at some ranches and you see the damage and debris from the previous floods of just a couple of years right by the dry creek bed. And you know, so many of those ranchers have cut off in April or early May.
You know, in regard to that, they're, like you say, they're still recovering from the damage from the high water, and we are suffering that on our own ranch. But as we talk about water in Wyoming, the reservoirs are still in pretty good shape. But the outstreams in a lot of areas where they raise hay for winter feed have really been hurting. Most of those in northern Wyoming never even had 1 day of irrigation. So they are really hurting, and going and finding that hay for winter forage is expensive if it's available.
And of course the hay prices, as we all know, have a very steep climb, doubling pretty much over last year. I heard that the hay crop is down by about a quarter, but those hay farmers that were able to pull in a crop, I mean, are they making a killing here?
You know, I might speak to that, and I think it's interesting how the situation works, that a lot of those producers that provide hay annually for their customer have kept their prices minimal. They've raised them some, but they are protecting us because they will know that we will be back next year and the next year and the next year, and so the street runs both ways there.
You know, I would say that the thing that you touched on that's maybe more important than price is the availability, and that's what I'm seeing down in my office in Cheyenne, getting a lot of phone calls looking for where is their hay, where is their pasture grass, and it's very difficult to find. I mean, we've reached out to my colleagues and others throughout the states close and some further away, just trying to find places to send cattle.
Well, you've had some public hearings actually around the state over the last couple of months.
We have.
What have you heard from ranchers and farmers?
We've heard a lot of what you're hearing today. I mean, we have an availability issue. We have a lot of ranchers that have taken the option of selling off parts of their herd or weaning off yearlings early, calves early, and taking yearlings off of their grass early, going to market as one of the options. And I think that those guys know how to manage their business. They've been in business in many instances for 3-4 generations plus. You don't get that way by not being good businessmen, and they're taking the option that they think is working best for them. But it's not a pretty picture out there from.
You know, I visited a number of ranches, Brett, where it goes back generations, and the rancher would talk about their dad and a few of the bad years. Mm-hmm. Historically, you know, as we look over the last century or so of Wyoming weather, has there been a period this dry, this bad?
I think if you look back, everybody thinks back about the 30s. And
Dust Bowl.
The Dust Bowl era. That even impacted Wyoming in terms of temperature and lack of precipitation. And as has been alluded to, here in Wyoming, we know how to stick through things and work through things and just get it taken care of so that we can keep going on. There's been periods of, so we mentioned high water, low water, hot temperatures, cold temperatures, and we just keep pushing through it. It just seems in the last 20, 25 years, we're a little bit more acutely aware of that. We've got better people monitoring the precipitation and the temperature around the state and seeing how it really impacts.
Well, you know, the runoff from the mountains is a big source, major source of water. And I understand that the gauges that have been maintained in the mountains are showing that the snowpack just isn't what it was. I mean, would you project in the future, how's that going to affect our future sources?
Well, I think the snowpack, I think, is just as variable as our spring precipitation. We got really used to 2 years of cool, moist conditions in the spring, and all of a sudden we hit one where from March until now we've been below normal and really warm. And so whether it goes back, whether it becomes more normal, and the same thing goes for the snowpack each year too. Sometime there have been a couple of years where we've been hurting all the way up through the end of February and worrying about how much water we're going to get, and all of a sudden the pattern goes favorable and we get these great wet spring storms that really load up the water content in the mountains, and we're all happy. It's going well.
You know, I did talk to one hay farmer actually, and I asked him, you know, because his crop was down by about 2/3, and I asked him how he was surviving. He said there's always planning involved, so that they were able to put away during some of the better years some reserve, but that they've gone through everything now. Is that pretty much, do you think people have gotten by with reserve, old grass, etc., but if this happens next year?
Well, like we've talked about, you know, the good producers, and been generations of them, usually run a pretty good reserve program if it's a grass bank or a haystack. And I think because of the good conditions last year, we had excess grass and we had hay left in the hay piles this spring, and that's going to save a lot of us. Well,
we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to really take the long view ahead. As you all know, there's an international panel on climate change, and their findings was that basically they're predicting about a 100-year drought in the American West and less rainfall each year. Your sense first of that, Brett, on those kind of findings?
Not exactly sure how to project out that far. You know, as forecasters up at the Weather Service office here in Riverton, we put our skill out to about 5 or 7 days, and anything beyond that is you know, we honestly say we're not quite sure in terms of specific variables. From the climate perspective, there's a lot of forces that are driving and could be leaning toward a drier situation for the American West.
Well, one of the factors that they pointed to was the fact that there are human-based carbon emissions. And I think we've all heard about this. And of course, what puts Wyoming into a bit of a corner is that we're a big exporter of carbon-based energy, coal, oil, gas. So I guess you'd have to sort of wonder, to save the ranchers, do we have to do something with the reliance on carbon-based energy?
You know, I certainly am not an expert on that, but I think one of the things that, you know, if someone goes down the road of carbon emissions, you know, one of the things that ranchers bring to the table is that their true crop is grass, and they said they sell that off through cattle and through sheep, but grass breathes carbon. And so I think it's a balancing act. I think one of the bigger issues in the Rocky Mountain West for now is the change of use pattern on the land. And I think that is that we have more and more people moving into the West, and so water gets diverted in different ways than it was traditionally used for. So I think that's going to be an interesting challenge as we move forward into the next 100 years, maybe more so than the climate itself.
So water rights could very well become a very much bigger issue.
There it could be.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to, you know, we have about a minute or so, and I wanted to conclude by saying that even though this is kind of a pretty dry and tough year, everyone I talked to seemed to have kind of a tough optimism. There was one said, "Don't bet against the cowboy," and I encountered that all the way around. Where does that come from, Jim?
You know, I think you go back in history. You know, clear back to the 1880s, and when a lot of this country was settled, those people were tough, and you know, and I think they left their toughness and their genetics here, and we're trying to carry that on, and And yes, we will survive. It might not be very pretty, but the cowboy will survive.
I guess just look at the landscape, right, Jason?
Amen. That's right. That is right.
Well, any last words of optimism on that account?
I think we just look forward to the future and deal with what Mother Nature gives to us and what we can provide for ourselves.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us here. Our thanks, of course, to you for joining us, and to Brett McDonald, Jim Wilson, and Jason Fernio. I'm Richard Ager, and be sure to catch us next time on Wyoming Chronicle.
Here we go. We're going with therapy kind of thing. We're going there. I'm going to be clean. We're going to go sit up there, 820 pounds, 61, 2. 61, 62, 15, 61, $2, 51, 52, 3, 52, 53, 52, 4, 53, 54, $5, 55, 59, 6, 7, 58, $57, 57, oh, let's do the there. 61, 2, 61, 61, 62, 61, 62, 61, 52, 3. 53, on your end. 52, 53, 53, 53, 3, got a word. 52, 53, 4. 54, 55, 59, 6, 23, happy. 4, now happy. Straight on. Can't 1. Got a blue eye, but 2. 80, $3, 4, 3, $2, half, and 3. 23, 3, half, $3, half. You now 23, $3, half, 4. 24, 4, half, $4, half, $4, half, $4, half. 124, $4, half, $124, half, $4.